very gracious introduction and kind of everything Robin said about me, I feel about her. I've learned an enormous amount from her and do. We're also great friends and love to hike together. I'm delighted to be talking with you today, and I'm very thrilled to be sharing the work that we're doing. I want to acknowledge the many, many people that have contributed. I'm just part of a big team, and we are very invested in understanding autism at the beginning, because what happens at the beginning shapes what happens for the rest of anybody's life. We all know that. And so focusing on the beginning helps us understand autism, and focusing on the beginning may help us improve outcomes for people with autism and their families throughout their lives. I want to acknowledge especially Sally Ozanoff, my partner in infant and early childhood work at the Mind Institute, my colleague Jerry Dawson, and Lori Vismara, who've been so involved in the treatment work that we've been doing in the last 8 years since I've been at the Mind Institute, my colleague Greg Young, who helps us think through all the research designs and analyze the data and is an incredible source of wisdom, and lots of students and colleagues who've made this all happen. I particularly want to thank the families and the children, because they've really been the ones who've taught us what we know. The students are the textbooks, they're the course, the kids are our mentors, and we learn from them. We've had a lot of funding. I'm very grateful to the funding from NIH, the Office of Education, the Mind Institute, and Autism Speaks, which has funded much of our early infant work. I receive royalties from several publishers. I receive honorary for talks. So those are the potential conflicts of interest that I might have. I will be talking with you today about three main topics. First, we're going to be talking about characteristics of autism in kids younger than 2. So we're talking about 1-year-olds and infants who are not yet 1. And I'll be sharing with you data from our studies and from studies of our colleagues across the world who are doing this very early work on emerging symptoms and the early course of autism and the patterns that autism takes early on. And finally, we'll be talking about intervention studies. How do we actually design interventions for the children who are as young as those that we're studying around early signs? And we've been doing a lot of work in that area in the Mind Institute, and we have a few other colleagues across the world who are doing it as well, and I just want you to know what's happening right now in that era, because I think this is the new wave of autism treatment, is beginning treatment before there's a diagnosis. So that's what I want to be talking about today. Can everybody hear me okay? No, you can't hear me okay. All right. Well, all right, so I'll talk louder. How's that? Is that better? Okay, great. Okay. So let's, who are the parents in the room? Where are you? Okay, great. I'm glad you're here. And where are the educators in the room? Special, regular, preschool, later, whatever. Super. Social workers? Great. Psychologists? Okay. Occupational therapists? Few hardy souls here. Speech and language pathologists, but there are a lot of you. Yes, hi. Physical therapists? Great. Hello. Administrators? There they are. Behavior analysts? Behavior analysts. Who've I forgotten? Okay, everybody I've forgotten. Okay, hi. Okay, glad that you're here. It's wonderful to have such a diverse audience. Everybody has a piece of knowledge in this room that nobody else has about ASD. And I think all through this conference you're going to be hearing about the many, many disciplinary inputs into both research and interventions. So you probably are reading a lot these days about focus on diagnosis and earlier diagnosis. And you may, especially parents of older kids, may be saying, what's the big fuss? Why is there so much emphasis on these early years of life when most people with autism are certainly beyond the age of 5? Well, there is a reason for it, and it's, it has to do with the science not only of early detection, but it actually has to do with the science of brain development and human development. And that's what we're really going to be talking about today. But I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what the problem is and why we're focused on this. This data comes from our colleague in Philadelphia, David Mandel, who did a large study of almost 1,000 families just a few years ago, in which he was trying to get at this sense of, at this point in time in this country, what is our mean age of diagnosis, and what is the gap between the time symptoms emerge and the time diagnosis is made. And we all know that, for better or worse, diagnosis is basically the gatekeeper for intervention services. That kids, it's very hard for families to get any kind of service until there is a label. And so what he found in this, he's looking at, I'm going to have to point over here, he's looking at 3 groups of children: children with autistic disorder, children with PDD-NOS diagnosis, and children and young people with Asperger diagnosis. And he asked the parents, how old was your child when you got the diagnosis, and how old was your child when you first had your initial concerns? And what we find is that the age of initial concerns is right here at about 12 to 18 months. Families report their first concerns. However, and this is generally when families raise the issue. When they are worried, they talk with their doctors about it. But the time between that conversation and a diagnosis of full autistic disorder in this country, in this day and age, is still right here at almost 4 years of age. For children who had a diagnosis of PDD-NOS, a milder form of autism, the mean age of diagnosis is over 5. And for those children who had a diagnosis of Asperger's disorder, the mean age of diagnosis is almost 8 years old. And so even for the most severely affected children across the country, we're looking at a gap of 1 to 2 years between the time that parents are raising concerns about their children and the time that diagnosis is made. Now, we're not even talking about then the wait for services to begin, IEP process to happen, and services to roll out. But this is a large gap. And the reason that we are worried about it right now is because of the increasing data that we have that shows that the earlier intervention starts, the more effective it can be. And if we're having a gap of this long, then we're talking about intervention beginning somewhere after the age of 4, when we've already lost almost 2 years of affected development. And so the question is, can earlier diagnosis lead to earlier interventions and better outcomes, and how early can we go? Now, you may be following the work in the under 2s, and if you are, one of the things that's very nice for psychologists, speech pathologists, and OTs, people who are involved in early diagnosis, to know is that the patterns of symptom development that we are seeing in 18 to 24-month-olds, so these children in the second half of their second year of life, the patterns of development that they are showing that are differing from children with typical development are areas of, they have general delays in development, they have delays in the development of body language, the use of the body for communication, reaching, pointing. Remember the 12 to 14-month-olds, you know, and how incredibly communicative they are before they ever have their first word. That whole foundation of communication in the body is not developing in young children with autism, and we already see this as early as 18 months. We also see a lack of emotional responsivity in terms of sending facial expression messages back and forth from parents to children. And again, as we think about how typical toddlers, how expressive they are, and how that little face looks around and it says, "I am so delighted," or "How could you do that to me? I'm so mad at you." They have so much they're telling us with their faces and their bodies and their gaze, or their refusal to look at us when they are really mad. This whole level of emotional communication, which most people think is the foundation of communication, that emotion is the language of infancy. Toddlers with autism don't seem to have this dialogue available to them either. They have feelings, they make facial expressions, but they don't send it or receive it as a way of sending messages to other people. So this whole area of knowing that messages flow from people and that you have access to another person's inner being through your face and your body, that knowledge does not seem to be available to 18 to 24-month-olds. They are not imitative people. They can imitate, but it's not a typical mode for them, unlike most toddlers who are imitating everything everybody else does, much to the chagrin of parents who let loose with a curse word or another behavior they'd rather not see their toddler imitate. Boom, there it is, and then you learn, gotta be more careful. Symbolic play, which we see in that second year of life as little girls start to move into, sorry, I don't mean to be gender specific here, but we do know from the research that little girls play more with dolls than little boys do, and little boys tend to gravitate more to cars and action figures. That play is emerging and clearly in the 18 to 24-month-old range, but not for little ones with ASD, who may or may not understand the pretend mode, but don't seem to get much pleasure out of it or the same kind of learning potential that typically developing children do. And finally, in 18 to 24-month-olds, unlike we thought 5 years ago, this pattern of repetitive behavior is already emerging. It doesn't look the same as it will at age 4 or 5. We don't see the typical patterns of finger movements or body movements that we do in a 4 or 5-year-old or an older person with ASD. But we do see repetitive patterns of play. We already see some interest sometimes in lining up or arranging things in certain ways. And we see a lot of interest in visual patterns, visual regard of objects, as very young children hold them up in front of their eyes, turn them with their hands to look at objects from different angles. These kinds of unusual visual regard patterns are already in place. And for those of you who know the patterns of autism in 2 to 5-year-olds, what you should be registering is, well, that sounds just the same as older preschoolers. It is. What we've learned is that that pattern of preschool autism, it comes down into the 12 to 18-month range. And this is allowing us to use tools like the ADOS, Module 1, particularly with the ADOS T-scoring system, to pull out the same pattern of behaviors. But what this also means is that we can use this same kind of differential profile to begin to try to separate 1-year-olds who are having more of an autism pattern from 1-year-olds who are having delays that are more focused on language patterns or on general delays. And what we see is this profile here of, here's a profile of a child with general delays who is functioning at about the 20-month level across the board. This is a pattern taken from my own data of children with an average age of 30 months, a group of about 50 children with autism and 50 children with other kinds of developmental delays, where when we look at the children with other delays, they show a rather consistent pattern across all of the subgroups of the Mullen scales: language, social behavior, cognition, self-care, fine and gross motor behavior, where the children who have ASD show similar motor patterns as do their DD partners for those who are the same developmental age. But we see this very atypical pattern, which is characteristic of ASD, of the greatest deficits in language and social skills compared to their overall mean. Their least affected areas in fine and gross motor development, not that it's unaffected, but just that it's a relative strength, and nonverbal cognitive abilities and self-care abilities kind of in the middle. So this particular pattern, I think, is quite useful when we're trying to sort out children with general delays who would have this flat pattern, or children who have primarily language delays who will show this deficit here, but not the holes in the middle. Will show a more focused difficulty with language, both verbal and nonverbal communication, but not areas of social play, imitation, the development of pretend play, although it is a little affected, and the cognitive area. So I'm not going to spend more time on the 18 to 24-month-olds because they do share patterns in common with other children. We're going to go down earlier than 18 months. We're going to head down into the 6 to 12 month period for the rest of the talk today, to say what have we learned about the emergence of autism and the patterns of autism in these early months, and are there even reasons to think we could see patterns of autism? And the answer is absolutely there's a reason to think it, and it comes from data that parents have provided us, both their retrospective records and their journals. Some parents are wonderful diarists, and we have learned a lot from the diaries that they keep about the development of their children. And so parents have reported to us different patterns, which we've been able to go back and look through. And parents have also, across the world, shared their home movies with us. And researchers in many countries, including France, Sweden, Canada, Norway, and the United States, and Italy, have mined those parent videos to compare the behavior of children who will later develop autism in their first and second years of life, compared them to children who will have typical developmental patterns later on, and children who eventually have other kinds of delays, to look for patterns that we can find in parent home movies. And from these kinds of parent sources, what we find is that there are several areas, there are 6 areas here listed, which we consistently find differences by the first birthday, according to parent gathered data for us, that will discriminate children who will later develop autism from children who will have typical development. And the key behaviors that are emerging by age 1 involve response to name. Children who will later develop autism are not as responsive to people calling their name as are children who have typical development. The amount of time children spend looking at faces, the amount of time or the numbers of times children imitate the people around them, their use of joint attention behaviors, and we're going to talk about joint attention a lot, so I'm going to define it right now. Joint attention is a particular way of sharing communication which involves a triangle of communication between baby, partner, and an object, like the bottle, water bottle, or a game, in which the partner and the baby are sharing their feelings or information with each other about this thing, this event, or this object. And so we see it in several behaviors. We see it in gaze shifts. If I was talking with you about this, wanted you to look at it, I'd look at you, look back and forth. A 9 to 12 month old will do that kind of gaze shifting to share with their partner that this is what they want them to focus on. It might be like, open it for me, open it. A little bit later, and we start to see a baby give this to mom to open it. So mom communicating, they need mom to interact with this and looking back and forth between the bottle. A slightly older baby will point to the bottle and say that they want it, or look mom, look at that cool bottle and I want you to open it for me. So giving, sharing, and showing, just holding it up to get parents to say, yeah, I see that bottle, what do you need? Those kinds of behaviors are the babies, the preverbal toddlers' triadic joint attention behaviors that say the baby can now coordinate their attention to the person and their attention to the object and bring those together as they share their thoughts and feelings with the partner about the thing. And that is a landmark accomplishment of the 9 to 12 month old. And that's what is telling us that babies are starting to understand kind of the person behind the eyes, that there's a whole mind inside the parent's head, behind their eyes, behind their facial expression. There's a mind in there, and the baby can corral that mind. They can corral their attention, they can send messages to it, and they can get parents to change their behavior all through these kind of invisible wave messages going through the air from body to body. That's a miracle of kind of interpersonal communication, of minds coming together. And this is what joint attention is all about, and this is what little ones with autism have great difficulty entering. It's as if the young child with autism, those of you who are my age remember the old Colgate commercials about Gardol, the invisible protective shield around your teeth. I kind of think about autism that way. It's like this invisible protective shield that bounces communication messages off and so that they are not coming in. The child isn't able to process them or capture their attention. So that's what joint attention is all about. Sharing affect, we've already talked about. Sharing communication and sending a message. I like that. I don't like that. I'm mad at you for doing that. Why would you say no to me when I want to dig in the dirt? Those kinds of things. And finally, stereotype behaviors, what we just talked about, repetitive actions with objects, visual regard, a little bit of hand flapping when babies are excited. All babies do it a little. Those who are developing autism might do it a little more. So those differences are already in place by 12 months for many children developing ASD, and we see it differentiating children who will later have those patterns from those who will have typical development. However, all those patterns do not differentiate ASD from children with other delays. Children who will have other delays also have imitation deficits, also have delays developing joint attention, delays with communicating emotion messages, and they may have some repetitive behaviors as well. The best differentiators from children with any other kind of delay is this response to name and the amount of time children spend looking at faces. Those really seem to be ASD patterns. However, as you might imagine, trying to understand all of ASD from a parent's home movie is a challenge because we're all parents, or most of us are. You know what you film. You don't film your kid throwing up or having a fit or picking their nose. You film the child at the first birthday. You film the child when they're taking their first steps. You film a happy baby who's waving at you and smiling. You also don't film your baby very much in interaction with another person. You don't just have clips of babies playing with parents. It's very much about the person who's behind the camera. So it's a limited amount of information that we can get from videos. And in order to really understand how babies grow into ASD, we are limited by what parents are sharing with us in video, and we have got to get into the whole first year. And for a long time, we were really stymied about how to do this. How do you economically carry out a study when 1 in 100 children may evolve this disorder and you want to follow them closely in time? Well, a way to do this is to work with a group that has a higher incidence of autism. And so in the last 15 years, various researchers have turned to the infant siblings of children who have autism to follow them as a high-risk group. And we've learned many, many things about infant siblings because we've been able to follow a whole group of children who may or may not develop autism but are at higher risk. So we get more payoff. It's kind of a that's kind of a crude way to think about it. For the researchers, you're getting a higher incidence of autism by studying infant siblings. And so many groups across the world have turned to this group to find out about the earliest pictures of autism. And Autism Speaks has been very generous in funding these infant sibling studies. All these researchers across the world are carrying out studies of infants from birth or 6 months of age through the age of 3 to 5. Studies in Italy, France, Canada, England, and Autism Speaks funds a network for us so that we are sharing data and being able to combine studies. We have over 1,000 babies that we are publishing data on right now, and we're analyzing those data for this whole network at the Mind Institute. So I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about what we've learned from the infant sibling studies about symptoms in the 6 to 12-month-olds. And what we are doing is studying, this is work that we are combining with our colleagues at UCLA. Marion Sigmund was the main principal investigator at the UCLA study. Sally Ozenoff is at the Mind Institute, and Ted Hutman is now playing a major role at UCLA as well. And we have, we're 8 years into this combined study. In the first 5 years, we have studied 224 children who had a brother or sister with autism and 124 children who had a brother or sister with typical development from the age of 1 to 6 months all the way through age 3. We're now following those children up through age 7, and we've started another group of babies, and we'll study another 300 infants. So we ourselves are going to have over 700-800 babies in our own sample to learn this kind of data on. And we study babies from the age of 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36 months, and up to 7 years. So you can do the math, 500 babies seen this amount of time across 2 labs. These are thousands of lab visits. It's a large and complex study. But we have been very lucky to find a representative group of, large group of families across California, well balanced with a nice balance of minority and majority families, lower income and middle income families who are participating. And so I'm going to share with you what we've learned. Kind of the big picture outcome is that, as we expected, children who, I'm going to talk about those babies who have a brother or sister with autism as high risk infants, and those who have a brother or sister with typical development as low risk, or the control siblings, comparison siblings. And what we've learned overall is that in terms of children who develop autism in this study, 28% of the high-risk boys, male babies, 5% of the girls have developed an ASD, whereas in the low-risk group, 4% of the boys and 3% of the girls have developed ASD. In terms of other kinds of concerns, another 35% of the boy high-risk infants and 16% of the high-risk girls have had another kind of difficulty, language delays, general delays, significant social impairments or anxiety disorders, whereas 15% of the boys and 6% of the girls in the comparison group have had that kind of outcome. So that in terms of the groups, 64% of the male baby high-risk boys develop some kind of difficulty, 21% of the girls develop some kind of difficulty, whereas with the low-risk groups, the numbers are 19 and 9%. So this definitely represents the fact that children who are brother or sister of a child with autism have a higher risk of some kind of developmental difficulty. And I think it means as clinicians, we want to pay attention to younger sibs and make sure that we don't overlook their often subtler problems than their brothers and sisters have. And it's also, parents are very aware of this. They're aware of their risks for their younger sibs, and they are watching. I think that's why they enroll in studies like ours. And I think one of the news here, this is all by age 3. These differences are detectable by the age of 3. And we don't know to what extent they're persistent. One of our colleagues in Israel, Dr. Nurit Yirmiyah, has followed a small group of children up to age 6 or 7. And she finds that many of these difficulties in the SIBs remit over time. Not the ASD, but language delays and other kinds of milder delays may go away over time. And so that's why we're studying our children later in life. We want to understand those patterns well. But I think it does verify the fact that ASD in the family does create risk for younger SIBs, not just for ASD, but for other disorders. Now let's talk about what are the sensitive behaviors which demonstrate greater risk for developing ASD in these young kids. And remember, I said to you before that response to name is something that differentiates ASD at 12 months. We actually looked to see whether that also differentiated children who would later develop autism at age 6 months. And we found, interestingly, that it didn't, that those babies who would later develop autism, when they were 6 months old, they did respond to their name, not quite as much as the other children did, but not at a level that was significantly different. Whereas at 12 months of age, they lacked that response. It did differentiate them at 12 months, but not at 6, the same babies. So hold on to that, because this is a theme we're going to have about kind of changing patterns in the babies. So response to name is something that, not by itself, it doesn't tell us, here's the data. For those babies who later develop autism, half of them do not respond to their name when it's called twice in the lab. Half of them do respond to their name. That means this is not a litmus test for autism, but 50% of children who will later develop ASD fail this task, whereas only 4 out of 26 who have another delay fail it, and virtually no children with typical development fail it. It is more sensitive and specific for autism, but it's not a litmus test. It's just a risk sign. Okay, what about what parents tell us? Do parents reports of their concerns? And I did go in and mess with the slides a little bit. I really apologize. I try so hard not to mess with slides after you have them printed out. But sometimes I've just made such an egregious mistake that I have to, so bear with me. And we will post these final slides for you on our website. This is a study that Dr. Osnoff recently published, and it's a study of parent concerns in our sample. When parents start to tell us they're worried about the babies, does that help us differentiate which babies will develop autism? And the findings here are basically that, okay, the top line represents the concerns of families whose children will later have ASD. This line right here represents the concerns of families who have a child who's a SIB. These are both SIB groups. And these two are the non-SIB groups. So what we see at age 6 months, which is right here, is that parents who have a child who's a younger SIB of a child with autism are more worried in general, and they report more concerns. But at 6 months, their concerns do not predict ASD. Half of those children go on to have no problem at all. In the children whose brother or sister are typically developing, parents have many fewer concerns. But the concerns of parents at 6 months do not predict ASD. However, by 12 months of age, parent concerns are very much linked to the development of ASD. You can see here, those SIBs who do not have ASD, the parent concerns are right down here with the parents of children who do not have an affected brother or sister. Those children who are on the ASD spectrum, their parents are reporting many more concerns. So by 12 months of age, parent concerns in a high-risk sample are quite predictive of later development. And this is a message to pediatricians, healthcare people, and 0 to 3 people that when you have a younger SIB whose parent is worried about them at 12 months, please follow up with an assessment, because parents are sensitive to something that is real. All right, what about this joint attention difficulty that I was talking with you about that does separate children with autism by 18 to 24 months? Remember I said to you the joint attention behaviors are just coming in 9 to 12-month-olds. Is it already something that's discriminatable? Well, I want to show you a videotape. Now bear with me with videotapes. Okay. Okay, this is a typically developing 12-month-old. Watch the gaze shifts. Watch his emotion messages. Watch his gestures. There's a sharing emotion and a comment. There's a show. There's a give. Gaze shift and sharing emotion and a comment. Okay, request. Here's a baby who will later develop autism. His parents have no concerns about him at this point. And they're experienced parents. Okay, there is no joint attention behavior there, right? There's no communication with the adult. His attention is on that object. If we took the object away and Dad turned around and played with him, you would see nice attention to Dad's face. But what's missing here is the joint attention. He's not shifting from the object to the person to the object to the person. He isn't using gesture. It's as if he doesn't know any communication can happen. He doesn't know how to say, hand that to me, or to indicate his desire for that object to the person yet. So the answer is yes. Already by 9 to 12 months, these very simple attention-shifting, gaze-shifting behaviors are discriminating babies who will later go on to develop ASD. This is something that we can see in an interaction with parents or with an examiner in the test room. This is a behavior that provides us with another risk sign of ASD at this age. Okay, now let's look at repetitive behavior. And I said to you a minute ago that repetitive behavior was something that we used to think wasn't present in infancy in ASD. But another paper from our lab, from our large data set, has actually looked at repetitive behavior in 12-month-olds, and we have found that there are clear differences in repetitive behavior even at the first birthday when you watch infants who will later develop autism and the way they play with toys. And what we see is that, first of all, they show very normal patterns. They mouth toys over here on the left side. They mouth, they bang, they shake, and they throw, just like typically developing babies of the same age do. And there are no differences in their use of typical play behaviors. However, they also spin things. They roll round things back and forth. They rotate objects in their hands, and they have unusual visual regard. All of these actually might be related to unusual visual regard, which an OT pointed out to me, and I want to pass out because it was a very nice observation. So we do see atypical patterns even by 12 months of age, and I want you to see these because we'll find this a different way. Even though they're subtle, that when you see them, they are very important to look at. And over time, you develop an eye for these, and they stand out to you in a way they didn't at first. So I want these to stand out to you. First, we're going to look, at a typically developing 12-month-old and the way that she plays with toys. And here's the mouthing, poking. Look at the gaze shifting back and forth to adults again. She's varying her play. She's flexible in what she does. Checks for reactions. Okay, here's spinning in a 12-month-old. Here's the wrist rotation and the unusual visual regard of this ring. And I couldn't figure out how a 12-month-old would spin things until this child showed me. They can't spin them, they just drop them in a certain way so that they will spin, and look at the pleasure in that. Yeah, he's really showing all of the behaviors right here. He didn't spin and he just starts it again. He knows it's quite goal-directed what he's trying to do with this. Okay, so it's quite subtle, but it's definitely there. Not all children who are developing autism have these, but when you see these are very pathognomonic. They should raise your concerns in a high-risk baby. All right. Moving along, motor differences. I've got to get off of this pretty fast. But motor differences, which some of the field has been telling us might be able to be sensitive to ASD at 3 to 6 months. We haven't been able to find it. I'm just going to give you the short story here. We've looked at motor behavior all the way from 1 month of age to 24 months of age in a study of over 6,000 minutes of parent home videos that we collected, rated by blind raters across 3 different groups. We used the Teitelbaum behaviors, if you know that study. We looked for abnormal reflexes, lack of protective reflexes, low tone, delayed achievements of milestones. We really did not find motor behaviors that separated ASD from the other groups of children in our studies. We did find that those things separated children who would develop later general developmental delays. Those children showed delayed milestones, and they showed more atypical movement patterns than did the other groups. But these were not characteristic of children with ASD unless those children also had significant developmental delays. So in a very large study of this, we were not able to find motor signs that specifically separated autism from others. And we also, I would love to show you this video, but I'm not going to do it because we're going to be, oh, yes I am. It's just such fun to look at. We've used this, if I do that, well, no, but I'll tell you, if I do this, I'm not going to be able to show you some infant treatment videos, and I bet you want to see those. I always make this mistake early on, so I'm going to skip. We have looked at babies' facial responses and their eye gaze to their mother's face at 6 months and at 12 months in this study. And we used that still face design, which you heard about probably in intro psychology when you took it, in which the mother is lively and the baby's looking, and then the mother goes still. And you look at the baby's reactions to the mother when she's still, and then the mother starts to smile again. And we really thought we would find differences in the amount of gaze the babies showed during that study. And we looked at this in 6-month-olds. And surprisingly, what we found was that we found no differences in those babies who were in the high-risk group, they had a brother or sister with autism, from babies in the low-risk group, either in their amount of smiles or upset during this paradigm, or, okay, we didn't find differences in affect. We did find differences in the amount of time they spent looking at faces. And we found that this is, this half of these are the babies who have a, these are the low-risk group. This is the high-risk group as a whole. And up here means they're spending more than half their time looking at eyes. Down here means they're spending more than half their time looking at mouths. We found that the low-risk group spends almost all of their time looking at eyes, but the risk group, those who have a sibling with autism, about 1/3 of them spend more time looking at mouths than at eyes. And we thought, oh, is that related to poor eye contact later? Will that help us sort out children with autism? Well, the children in red are the children who developed autism. They're here, here, and here. They spend all their time looking at eyes. This does not help us figure out children who will develop autism. The children who spend more of their time looking at mouths, as we followed up with them, we found that those children had more advanced language development. Yeah, so the importance of following up your data. We actually ended up realizing that the children who, and they're more advanced in the number of words they have, the more words we hear in the lab, the more words their parents report, their receptive language. They're more interested in mouths probably because they're really mapping sounds onto visual. They're bringing these two inputs together to figure out speech. So this was not predictive of autism. And it was an interesting finding, but this I wanted to share with you, and then I'm going to move right into treatment. What I'm going to show you now are the patterns of development from 6 months to 36 months in these infants who develop autism compared to the low-risk children who have typical development. And what you're going to see over these slides, these are scales from a standard infant test. It's called the Mullen. And you're going to see their standard score. So where are they functioning? 50 is normal on this test. Here are the low-risk infants with typical development on their language measures, receptive and expressive. And we see 6 months, 12 months. Sorry, you don't have that slide. You don't see the numbers. There it is. 6, 12, 18, 24, and 36 months. We see these children hovering right at the typical range and becoming a little bit accelerated. It's a slightly higher SES group by the time they're 24 to 36 months. Here are the kids who will develop ASD. What I want you to see is that at 6 months, they are completely in the normal range. But by 12 months, there's statistically significant difference. They've dropped 10 points. By 18 months, they're continuing to drop. And 24 to 36 months, look, the gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger over all this time period. This is language development. It's no difference in the beginning and this growing gap. Okay, here are motor scores. This is fine motor and visual motor scores. Typical group, group who will develop autism. Exactly the same pattern. Typical at 6 months. Beginning gap at 12, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, all the way to 36 months. It's the latest we followed them at this point. What is going on here? This is not regression. Not a single child in the sample has lost any skills. This is not regression. This is a slowing of developmental rate. It's also happening in social behavior, in the amount of time they spend sharing gaze with other people, smiling, vocalizing, and interacting with other people. And I'm going to skip that. I can't skip this. All right, I have to tell you this. It's a big part of the story. So here are the 13 children in our Denver sample who developed autism. At 36 months, they are all diagnosed with autism. Of those 13 children, at 24 months, we could not diagnose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the 13 do not yet have enough symptoms to diagnose with autism, although we're worried about them. At 18 months, only 3 of them have enough symptoms to diagnose, although all of them have some developmental delays. At 12 months, nobody has symptoms enough for us to say we think they have autism, and over half of them are showing no developmental problems at all to us under our lab microscope. That's not really a microscope. And at 6 months, only 1 baby has any developmental concerns at all. So even though a minute ago I told you that we could discriminate autism at 18 to 24 months, and even at 12 to 18 months in some children, in general, what I'm telling you here is that those kids who will develop autism are not necessarily discriminatable, even at 24 months of age. What does this mean for early diagnosis? This means that we've got to do repeated screenings and repeated workups, right? If we are going to try to do public health efforts to identify all children with ASD as soon as possible, we're not going to be able to screen only at 12 months and find them. And we're not going to be able to screen only at 12 and 18 and 24 months and find them. We are going to have to carry out screening activities all the way across the first 5 years of life if we're going to be able to find every child with Asperger's, PDD-NOS, or autism as soon as possible. Because these are all kids with full ASD, and almost half of them are not diagnosable until 36 months of age. So that's a really important message, I think. And I don't think a biological test is going to get us here either, because I think what we're going to find out is that there is a very, very complex biology to autism, and that we're not going to ever have a litmus test for autism like we have for Fragile X or Down syndrome. And we're going to come to that point in a minute. But in terms of early diagnosis and early treatment, first of all, early diagnosis, we're going to have to keep diagnosing all across this age period. But in terms of early treatment, we are having concerns as early as this period. And if we want to start treating at the time of first concerns, then we've got to evolve interventions that can be picking up babies before they have autism and tailoring interventions to them. And that's where we're going to end up with this talk. So I'm going to skip that slide and go. All right, so now we're shifting to what does this mean about what's going on in the brain? How does this pattern of late onset, how does that jive with how we understand autism? And now we're going to move into kind of brain models of autism, just for a few minutes. And I'm going to throw up I think the model that a lot of our biological scientists are working on right now, which is the idea that autism is a biological disorder, which we all know, and that the underlying biology affects the brain. And that the brain abnormalities, whatever they are, that are caused by the biology of autism, affect the functioning, the day-to-day functioning of various brain systems, and that these differently functioning brain systems result directly in symptoms. I think this is a pattern that many people are working on right now, that the biology of autism leads directly to symptoms. Well, what do we know about the biology of autism? We do know that there are abnormalities based on pathology studies and imaging studies at every level of brain development. And some of this is pretty new. Some of these slides are just published in the last few months, but I want to show you at the level of the cell. This was exciting to me. I found this over Christmas vacation when I was in the lab reading. Of course, I didn't do this. Here's an example of a difference at the individual level in a neuron, a pyramidal cell, which is our basic neuron, which is sending information and building neural networks to help us think and develop and talk and do all those things. Here's the body. Here's the connections to all these dendrites here. This basic pyramidal cell. Okay, in many other developmental disorders, we have fewer dendrites, these little spines that come out and that grow into connections like this with all other neurons and create the neural networks that allow us to do a lot more and more elaborate things with our brains and our minds and our bodies. Many disorders like Fragile X have too few spines. Autism, this study suggests that there are too many spines on an individual cell, a pyramidal cell with autism. Too many spines are going to make too many connections. And we're going to come back to this message about connections, so hold on to that. Too many spines make too many connections, and too many connections is not necessarily a good thing. Okay, so at the individual level of a brain cell, there's a potential biological abnormality in connectivity. And let me just stop. And for those of you who don't, these cells, the dendrites move out. They make all kinds of connections. There's this huge proliferation in the first couple of years of life of these dendritic connections, and they connect all over the place. They grow like weeds, give babies the incredible learning potential that they have, make them this incredibly fast learner. But over time, that having all kinds of connections like that, it's not actually a very useful kind of brain to have. It's like for the women, sorry, I do that, I shouldn't do it. For those of us who have lots of clothes in our closet and have packed closets, as you know, too much stuff is not good. Too much stuff makes you disorganized, and it prevents you from quickly getting dressed in the morning and making great decisions. It's the same with the brain. Too many connections make a lot of noise. We don't need all of that. So after this period of proliferation, what normally happens in the toddler years and here and there throughout life is a pruning process in which then the brain starts to pare down the connections. And the ones that haven't been used are the ones that get pared down. So the system, this is use it or lose it, and it happens forever. The systems we're using are strengthened, they build, and we have networks that support the skills we use. The more we learn, the bigger and the stronger the networks are. And that goes on throughout life. That's learning. Learning is building more connections and strengthening the connections that are there. Those things that we don't use, they go away. It makes noise for us. So we want an efficient, fast brain. So too many connections is a great thing early on for babies. Babies need connections, but they've got to go away, or we've got kind of a sloppy closet of connections there. So at the individual cell level, we have abnormalities. Here are cell connections. Those cells are arranged in columns, vertical columns that go up through the layers of the cortex, and they connect all the layers of the cortex in this vertical way. So messages go very quickly up and connect the different layers of the cortex, and then it goes out across different brain regions. Those are called mini columns, the way those neurons connect. And our colleague Manny Casanova published in 2003 and has now replicated many times that in autism, these columns are disorganized. They have too many cells. Here's a nice straight typical column in a typically developing brain. Here are these messy columns, too many cells, not nicely aligned in ASD. Here you can see the lines through them in a typical brain. Here we see this kind of messy, jagged patterns in ASD brains. All right, these are message routes, and the message routes are not direct. It's like the back roads versus the interstate. We got a problem here in connectivity. And then at the third, so now let's move from those columns to the connections back and forth across the brain. We also have evidence that in autism, these long-range connections from here's cerebellum up to frontal lobes, and here's the amygdala and the emotion system up into the cortex. In autism, there seem to be difficulties with long-range connections, fewer of them, and a proliferation of short-range connections. Well, what does this do? It means that skills that require a lot of integration across the brain, complex things like language, like abstract thought, would be slighted in a brain wired like this, and things that require local connections, like really great visual perceptual skills, really intense focus on details, those would be supported by a brain that's more connected in the short range and less connected in the long range. Our fMRI data suggests this is how autism is wired. Here's an example of what's involved in an imitation task. In imitation tasks, the entire brain has to be involved, from the visual input system in the back of your head, your occipital lobe, up to the superior temporal sulcus, in which your brain sorts out, this is me, this is my body, these are my body parts that are involved, up here to the inferior parietal lobe, which says, is it me or is it somebody else? And it links what you're seeing with what you're doing. Those messages go to the mirror area, which trigger motor representations and say what you see is what your body can do, and that goes to the motor output system, which gets you moving, and this is how you do a motor imitation task. Seems to require a lot of long-range connections. And here's an autism brain compared to typical brains during an imitation task. Look here at the typical brain. Look at all these patterns across this middle section. This is all the activation that's going on during an imitation task. Look at this little spot in this brain with autism. Look at this wide expanse here in the frontal area. Look at this much smaller area in the right hemisphere. And the same thing in the left. This whole part of this brain is involved. Here it's much more focal, and same here. So what we're seeing are these longer range patterns are compromised. Okay, but there's another model of autism that I want to share with you, and this is what intervention is all about. Many of us actually don't buy the idea that the brain connects directly to symptoms. This isn't how babies grow. This isn't how we work. This is not how human brains develop. Human brains are sculpted not just from the biological information, but from the experiences that go on moment by moment. So this is a transactional model of development in which the baby's moment-to-moment experiences, which are exciting neurons and neural networks and building connections, are actually sculpting brain patterns, building long-range connections, building short-range connections, and strengthening patterns that will stay when they're used or be pruned if they're not used. And what a transactional model says is that the biological basis is interacting constantly with the social environment, and that those two things together are creating development, and that it's differences in development that are causing symptoms, and that the baby's behavior, whether it's typical or atypical, is constantly affecting the environment that the baby lives in, and these changes that the baby's behavior is making change the baby's experience, affect baby's brain development, are reflected in behavior, and this cycle, it cannot be reduced into causal patterns of either biology or environmental input, that it's like a chemical reaction, that all this is going on, and the baby and the baby's behavior is a main player in eliciting what's going on for the baby in the environment. And our model suggests that the impairment, the biological predisposition in autism, may have to do, this is from our colleague Peter Mundy at the Mind Institute and Jerry Dawson, may have to do with the reward system of the social brain. That the biological system, it's not a hole in the head. It's not a lack of connections. It's an idea of weights that people, that experiences with other people, which from the newborn period on are preferred by most babies. And so they must be giving them something uniquely interesting or rewarding, that weight system is a little bit off in autism. And because it's a little bit off, it changes the baby's interest level in what's going on in the social world around them. The baby's a little less interested in the people world, makes the object world a little more competitive with the people world for the child with autism. And if that goes on over time, the baby is not paying enough attention to the social world. They're not in the middle of it. They're not getting the social information that they need, and they're creating a kind of a social deprivation for themselves because they're not in the middle of the teaching environment, which is the family. And if that doesn't change, then their different experiences are sculpting a different brain. And as the pruning processes start, the social networks that are not being used, the communication networks that are not being used or haven't been developed, that potential is going to be pruned away. And a different brain is going to be sculpted by the early experience of autism unchecked in the first 5 years of life. It sets a different path in place. Just like a baby who's being raised in an incredibly musical environment, that brain is being sculpted in a certain path. And a baby who's being raised in an extremely visual or athletic environment, that brain and body are being sculpted in a certain way. This brain is being sculpted in a certain way. And we have evidence for this. We have evidence that different environmental inputs into children with autism in the first 5 years of life have effects as long as into adulthood on their language development and their understanding of social messages, even though they've had 16 years of schooling and intervention. What happens in the first 3 years of life sculpts a brain with autism just like it sculpts a typical brain. And so that means that our goal in early intervention is to build neural networks. And we want to be targeting the primary symptoms of autism, which are where the neural networks need to be developed. Imitation, social orientation, reward for social engagement, joint attention behaviors, communication, and particularly the sharing of emotion messages, which provide, and imitation and joint attention provide the foundations for speech. Now, a various number, so this means to me is that as we're moving into infant and toddler interventions, we are now at the point where the difficulties are first emerging. We're at a very precious point in autism because the gaps are just starting. As I've shown you, the symptoms are just emerging. This is the most plastic time we will ever have for building the networks we need, sculpting a brain that is more social and more communicative, and building the processes that will help children take the more social and communicative route. And so a number of people who are now focused on toddler interventions, as a matter of fact, Autism Speaks has helped fund an entire network of projects. They're doing interventions for 12 to 24-month-olds. We're one of them with the Early Start Denver model. We're doing that study here. All of these interventions are using play-based, interactive, and relationship-based strategies targeting joint attention, emotional nonverbal communication, imitation, and social input, with the idea that these mediate the development and moderate development in symbolic play, language development, and learning rates. And that focusing here in infants and toddlers is how we are going to change the phenotype of autism. I have only 6 minutes left. I'm going to just tell you that we recently published a study of intervention. So what's happening now in the new intervention literature is that people are moving down, down, down in age. I'm going to give you a little bit of data to show you what we're finding. Here is a study that Jerry Dawson and I published in December in the Pediatrics Journal. This is a randomized controlled study of toddlers with autism ages 18 to 30 months, 48 children in Seattle, randomized either into the Early Start Denver model or to community intervention. These children were assessed yearly And the children getting Early Start Denver model received 20 hours a week of one-to-one intervention in a play-based, relationship-based developmental model with very good teaching, applied behavior analytic teaching underlying it, but not discrete trial teaching, play-based intervention. The groups received similar numbers of hours of treatment. Both of these groups received 18 to 24 hours of treatment a week across the 2 years of the study. What we found on the Mullen scales at the end of 2 years was a significant difference, an almost 20-point difference in IQ between the two groups, both of them starting at an IQ of 60, with the children in the ESDM group acquiring almost 20 IQ points, ending with an IQ of 80, outside of the range of intellectual disability. The children in the community group also making some gains, but with an IQ of about 65 or 66. This also occurred in expressive language, where again you see, particularly in the second year, a large and significant difference on expressive language. It's also there with receptive language. The difference was even a little bit larger in receptive language. We found this in adaptive behavior as well. Parents' reports of children's everyday language at home. So this isn't just about standardized test performance. This is about everyday functioning in real life environments. A very significant difference there, over 11 standard points in functioning on the Vineland overall. And we found changes in the diagnosis, in which the group with ESDM showed a significant improvement in diagnosis from autistic disorder to PDD-NOS, whereas we found the opposite pattern with the comparison group, that there was a greater rate of worsening from PDD-NOS in that group than in the ESDM group. So I think this is the first randomized controlled trial of a toddler study using a play-based approach, which is out there. And now we're moving younger and younger. I think here before we have reported work with parents, and we've been working for several years on a model in which we're teaching parents to carry out Early Start Denver model. We've been funded by Autism Speaks to do that. We did a study here a few years ago using a single subject design in which I will show you that video because I want you to see it, but let me tell you first of all the data. These are parent uses. This is very cheap intervention. This is 1 hour a week for 12 weeks. That's it. This occurs right after intervention. It was delivered right after diagnosis. It was delivered by the people who did the diagnosis. We developed this intervention particularly for families in the Alta Regional Center who have, I think many families do, have that gap between diagnosis and the beginning of more intensive services. And it's a time when families really want to do something, and we were trying to figure out what can we do, what can we help families do that would put some good intervention in place in that waiting period and give families a feeling like they can do something and they can make a difference. This is the data on the parents' learning of the ESDM techniques. This is their baseline level, about 50 to 70%. This is every week, their scores. And what we find is in about 6 hours of teaching, parents are essentially at therapeutic levels right here, levels we expect from our own therapists. And for the 12 weeks, they tend to maintain it. When we stop doing intervention and just follow up with them, parents continue to build and improve their skills on their own. So we found that parents can learn this intervention. And does it affect the children? Absolutely. Here are the numbers of words their children are using. No words at the time of start. These are 8 different children under the age of 3. And here we go across 12 different weeks. This is in 10 minutes of play. How many different words do the children spontaneously speak, no imitation, in 10 minutes? And you can see this increase over time in the entire group. And here's where treatment stops, and you see that parents are maintaining this and continuing to grow it even after we stop. This is parents playing with their children. This is the therapist in 10 minutes of play. Parents are very good at eliciting speech. This is with a new therapist. Child's faced with a stranger, and you still see now an average of, what is that down there? 20 to 25 words in 10 minutes, different words. This is just 18 weeks from completely nonverbal children in 1 hour a week of treatment focused on parents. I want you to see the difference, and I guess this is what we're going to end with, is what parents can do. So here, just a second, let me find my video. All the parents that I'm showing you have given me permission to show these tapes in places like this. All right, we're going to open this one. This is the first visit of this little child. He's 24 months old. We've asked parents to show us how they play with him. He has no words. He's quite repetitive in his play, as you will see. The parents really try to interact with him. This is a good example of what I mean about kind of the symptoms get in the way of the learning. The parents trying to show him how to do it, but the child really is persisting in his own pattern of covering things up. You know, the dad tries to take it, he tries to play. The little child does a pretty fast rejection of dad's efforts here. Boom. Forget that. You know, so mom's made 2 initiations, dad's made 2. Here mom's making a 3rd. The child is not responding to them all, and he's really stopping them in their tracks. This is what I mean about autism kind of changing the environment. And yeah, you'll see this go on, and what you see over time is parents are even in this few minutes, parents do less and less because the child is giving a very clear message. I want to do it myself. They're sensitive parents. They read his message. Okay, here are 4 hours later. This is dad. Now this is, I'm happy to tell you this. A father couldn't come to our sessions. Mother came to the sessions and then went home at night and shared the materials and told dad what we were doing, and dad picked it up. And so we have a video of dad 4 weeks in. If that's my phone, I apologize. We've got messy video here. Hold on, I can get this through a different way.
Okay, we can close the class. Can you help me? Put lid on. Put lid on.
Okay, so he's talking. He's saying, blocks, please, open. Don't want green. He has a certain color order he wants. That's what's happening here.
It's your turn. It's not your color. Put that in. What color? Yellow. Yellow. Here's something in mind. It's blue. Blue. Okay, please. Okay, Daddy's turn. The yellow. Hey. Look
so you get the idea here. We've got a lot of development in 4 one-hour sessions, transferred from one parent to another with all the work going on at home. Therapists have less than 5 minutes with their hands on the kids during this intervention. It's all done through the parents. And so what I'm really ending up saying here is that as we identify children with autism younger and younger, we have got to have interventions that are fitting into them. And the younger the children are, the more flexible and plastic their brains are, the more we have the opportunity to add kind of transactional and environmental experiences that may be able to really write the course here, and that can provide the kind of transactional inputs that will sculpt the brain much more into the communication and social mode. We're currently carrying out a study of an intervention for 6 to 11-month-olds who are starting to show some of those early symptoms I talked to you about, to see whether in fact we can start an intervention well before the whole syndrome is taking place, and whether we can steer children into more eye contact, into more communication, and into more social play at the very, very earliest signs. If you know any families who are worried about their babies, please let them know about this study. We would love to meet them and work with them. And we may well be at the point in another few years where we have interventions all the way down for targeted symptoms into 6 to 12-month period, and that we'll be able to really get rid of the need to have a diagnosis to have services driven, but to really be able to match interventions with individual symptoms and work in the very beginnings of autism to shape things in a direction that will build the kind of neural networks that are going to support better social development, better communication development, and much more optimistic outcomes. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you, and I've enjoyed being here.
The UC Davis Mind Institute began in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, learning disabilities, and other brain disorders is helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please call or visit our website to find out more about current studies, our research team, and upcoming events.